Welcome to this first lesson in a series of lessons that we will be focusing on the Old Testament book known as Esther. There will be 6 lessons in this series, which is entitled God in the Shadows. This first lesson comes from chapters 1 and 2, and it is entitled God Works Behind the Scenes. A little background about the book of Esther. There's no statement in the book itself as to who wrote the book of Esther. From reading the book and the internal evidence, it would suggest that this book would have been written by a Jewish person who probably was living in Persia after the fall of Babylon, who was very familiar with both the Persian customs and the Jewish customs. Now, at the end of the book, we learn that really the purpose of the book is to explain the origin of the Jewish feast of Purim. And as we go through these lessons, we'll see that explanation come into meaning. But for someone to be writing this type of book, they would have had to have understood the custom of the Jewish custom of the Feast of Purim, and then understood the factual incidents that led to the creation of that feast. There are many details that are contained in this book that suggest that this was someone who was Jewish, very familiar with the Jews and their customs and their history, but also had a vast knowledge of the Persian Empire, suggesting that that person probably lived there at the time. Now, as to when it was written, there are debates. A minority view is that it was written as late as 130 BC, which would have been under while Israel or Judah was under the control of the Greeks. The suggestion is that this book was written as a means of encouragement and giving comfort to the Jews who were suffering seriously under the Greeks, and this story was told as a means of encouragement and comfort. However, the vast majority of scholars believe that this was in fact written by someone either at the time this happened or within a reasonable period of time after it happened. The suggestion is that it was written probably at least before 330 BC. Now we're going to find these incidents happen. This incident happens in 483, along in there, BC. So it could be that many years, 10, 20, 30 years after the incident, someone sat down and wrote it down. It could have been written immediately after it happened, or it could have been written later. But it was someone who probably was living in the Persian Empire, knew these facts, knew the incident that happened, and was Jewish in his background as well. There are no Greek words contained in the book, and the use of the old Jewish Persian words suggests that it probably was someone living during the Persian Empire. Now, one of the features of this book that marks it unique amongst other books in the Old Testament, it is one of only 2 books in the Old Testament that never mentions the name God. Now, as we go through, we're going to point out that it is very clear that this whole book is about God in the shadows, but it doesn't come out and mention the name God or refer to God by name anywhere in the book. There are so many circumstances that happen. Now, at the risk of destroying the story, I want to go through now and point out some things, and then when we go through the story over the next several weeks, you can see how these things show that in fact God was in control. For example, it just happened that the queen disobeys the order of the king. She wasn't a Jew. For her to disobey was just something that was out of the ordinary for a Persian woman to disobey the orders of her husband and king. Not likely to happen unless God's in control. The king just happens to pick Esther for his queen. Mordecai just happened to have overheard the plot the conspiracy to kill the king. It just happened that that plot and the story of that plot was written in the official records of the palace. It just happened that the king had a sleepless night, and to pass the time of a sleepless night, had them read from the current records and hear the story of Mordecai. It just happened that the king allowed Esther to enter when she comes in to speak on behalf. All of these things just happen, or do they just happen? I think you'll see as we go through this book, God is the center of the book, even though he's not mentioned by name. Now, this book is about the role of two women. That also distinguishes it from the rest of the Old Testament, because women aren't usually the main characters. This book centers around Esther and Queen Vashti. So this is a book about two females, and it's notable that in that day the females were considered second-class citizens, to be nice. The best you can say about them is that they were property. They were at the beck and control of the men, their husbands, especially if you belong to the king. And we're going to see both of these women taking positions, asserting themselves in ways that is totally out of the ordinary for the culture of that day. It's a very unusual book in that it features two females who are acting out of the ordinary for the culture of their day. Historical background. After the Medes and the Persians defeated the Babylonians, and you remember in our series on Daniel, we talked about how that happened. And then the kings that came in, the Persian kings of Cyrus, and then Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes, there was a series of kings who were Persian, who were ruling this whole area of the world. Now, as I said, Cyrus was the first Persian king, major Persian king, and he ruled from 559 to 530. Now, Babylon fell in 538, so he is the king of the Persians, and he is the king when his army conquers Babylon, and he rules after 538 in the fall of Babylon. He rules another 8 years until 530. He's followed by several other kings. Eventually, Darius the Great rules, and he's ruling from 522 to 486. Now, Darius the Great is succeeded by his son in 486, whose name is Xerxes, and he rules from 486 to 465. Now, that was his Persian name. Xerxes' Jewish name was Ahasuerus. Now, we're going to find that there were several people who were given that name by the Jews, Ahasuerus, and whoever wrote this book wanted to be sure that we knew that it was Xerxes he's talking about. So he refers specifically to Xerxes by name, even though the Jews would have called him a different name. The setting of this incident is in Susa. Now, as I mentioned, the Persians had conquered whole, vast area of the world. Several different countries or kingdoms had been conquered by the Persians. And the Persians actually had, at one point in time, 4 cities that were considered capital cities. However, Susa was considered to be the administrative capital, or the capital where the king would live and rule from. Now, it wasn't the king lived there year-round. He usually lived there in the winter. However, in the summertime, it got too hot, and so he would go elsewhere. The city was a city from antiquity that had been fought over many different times, had been destroyed, and then Cyrus, when he was the king of the Persians, he rebuilt the city, And then Darius comes in and does some more major building, not only of the city, but of a road system. He was remembered as Darius the Great. And part of it not only is because of his military conquering, but because of the building that he did, not only of this city, but of the road system. Now, he builds the city, and in building the city, there are 3 major mounds, or hills, if you will, that are built around the city. And on one of those mounds, and they refer to this as the citadel of Susa, for a good reason, on one of those hills was this huge palace. I mean, it was a major construction. It occupied 10 acres of land. It had a great audience hall with 36 stone columns that went up 70 feet in the air. Each of these columns weighed 25 tons. The building, just to see it, would speak to you of extravagance, luxury, opulence. Okay? Historians, secular historians, describe some of the events that occurred in that great hall. And they speak of the nobles drinking from very fine gold goblets, drinking very expensive wine, and that they're on couches, and the couches were covered with very expensive jewels. Again, speaking of luxury and opulence. This is the setting for this particular story. With that, let's begin in Esther, and let's begin chapter 1 and read a few verses. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. Okay, let's stop right there. The fact that it says he ruled over 127 provinces, this is to try to make sure that we identify who the proper Xerxes is, who the king is. He was king over this vast area. And he says his kingdom stretched from India in the east all the way to Cush, which is Ethiopia, south of Egypt in Africa. So he ruled over this huge area of the world, and he was in the citadel of Susa, the administrative capital, at the time this happens. In the 3rd year of his reign, now he took the throne in 486 BC, so this would be 483 BC. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. The timing of this suggests that he has called in all of his officials from this far-flung empire and brought them together and is having a banquet. Now, what we know is that in 482, this happens in 483, in 482, he actually takes his army out to fight the Greeks. And they will be engaged in a 3-year fight and lose that battle to the Greeks. But the suggestion here is, the commentators make, is that he's called all of these nobles from all over the kingdom, different countries, different places. He's called them together, and he has this great banquet as he is getting them ready and preparing them to go to war, to go out and fight the Greeks. So it's thought that it was in this time of preparation, that was maybe the motivation for him having this banquet. But he has people there from all over the empire, nobles, officials, etc. For a full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. So he has them there, and they're there for a while. They're there for 6 months. And the reason is he's getting them ready to go out to battle. And part of getting them ready is to motivate them by showing them how powerful he is, how wealthy he is, how strong he is, and currying their favor to support them in battle. He says, when the days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days. Now, he's called them all together. He's had this 6 months of working with them, getting them ready to go to battle, and now he gives a 7-day banquet in the closed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Now this is this huge palace garden that I was talking about, known for its opulence and luxury. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. Here are these marble pillars. And from them they've got these hangings, curtains if you will, or displays. These hangings of purple royalty. And they use silver rings to attach them to the post. Again, luxury, opulence, wealth. There were couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavement of Potiphar and marble and mother of pearl and other costly stones. So here is this floor that's made out of costly stones and marble, and then there are couches out there in these gardens for them to recline on while they're eating and drinking. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. Again, the extravagance. It wasn't a set of goblets all made just alike. They are all made separately and individually crafted, indicating wealth. And the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. Again, this was a major feast, a major banquet, and there is no sparing of expenses. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine steward to serve each man as he wished. Now, this is an interesting statement, because the suggestion is, from historians, that the normal rule of that culture was that if somebody proposed a toast, everybody was supposed to drink. If you couldn't join in with every round that was being consumed, you leave the party. The king seems to say here, nobody leaves the party. You don't have to keep up with all the drinking. Everyone was allowed, despite what the normal rule was, everyone, by the king's order, was allowed to drink at his own rate. So if you were not a heavy drinker, you weren't being forced to follow the lead of those who were. Now, look what happens. At the same time, Queen Vashti, this would be Darius's wife, also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Excuse me, not Darius's wife, but Xerxes' wife. His wife gives a banquet for the women who had accompanied their husbands to this 6-month meeting in preparation for war. On the 7th day, and here is where we get into the essence of this lesson, and on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was high in spirits from the wine, I think that's a way of saying he was maybe, if not totally intoxicated, his inhibitions had been reduced by the amount he has consumed. But he has been consuming wine, and suggestion would be that the others have as well. He was in high spirits from the wine. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and then we have their names there, to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Okay, here's what we have here. Obviously, the queen is a very beautiful woman. The king has all of his nobles and men there. They're drinking. They've been drinking for days. They're in high spirits. It's not stated. There's some suggestion that maybe there had been other types of entertainment that had been going on. Maybe some others, others of the king's palace were there. The females were dancing for them or whatever. But the king decides he's going to do something unusual. Now, you need remember to understand the role of women back then. A proper woman, an acceptable woman, a woman who was following the cultural norms did not interact with strangers, men. In fact, she would wear a veil, keep her face covered. She would not in any way engage with men. That was the cultural rule. Now, the king decides he's going to defy culture. He's the king. And he orders that she be brought in so that all these people, all these nobles from all over the world could see her beauty. Now, there's two or three things going on here that's not stated. However, we have historians who suggest it. There is a Jewish tradition. It's not in here, but there is a Jewish tradition that says when the book says, the scripture says, she was to come in wearing her crown, the suggestion by the Jewish tradition is that the men in the banquet were all arguing about whose women, which country's women, were the most beautiful, and the king wanted to prove that the Persian women were the most beautiful, so he wants to call his wife in to display her beauty to settle the argument. There's also tradition or suggestion that when it says she was to come in wearing her crown, they're suggesting she would be wearing only her crown. That is, he wanted her to come in nude. Again, this is not stated, but this is what some suggest as to what's going on. Bottom line is, he sends an order to his queen to tell her to defy culture and to come in, and even if it's not sensual like some of the suggestions may be, if she's going to come in and even remove her veil and show off her beauty, that would have been contrary to the culture, to the norm of the day. What happens? But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Here is this queen, female, basically, who has no rights at all. She refuses, number one, the order of her husband. That is not acceptable in that culture. Number two, the order of the king. You just don't defy the order of the king, especially if he's your husband. Or maybe I put it the other way around. You don't defy the order of your husband, especially if he's the king. She defies the king. She defies her husband. She says, I'm not going to come in. The king is furious. The king became furious and burned with anger. The king here has a problem. He has not only a female, but his wife, who has refused his order in the presence of these nobles from all over the world. He is totally embarrassed. He's upset because she refused to obey his order, but he's also upset because he has been embarrassed. He has been embarrassed that she has defied his order. Now, there is one school of thought. One commentator says that the reason she didn't come in is because, really, she was pregnant with Artaxerxes, with Xerxes, the son of Darius. That's what one suggestion as to why she didn't come in. Another suggestion was that she was more committed to the cultural norm than she was to the order of her husband. One tradition says that she was ready to comply with the king's order, but she was struck by leprosy by God. Now, that's nowhere in here, but that is a story. For whatever reason, she made the decision to defy the king. A very, very unexpected turn of events. She made a decision to defy the king. Verse 13, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. And he gives us their names. The 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. So he realizes he's got a problem. So he brings in his close cabinet, and these are all Persians and Medes, and he says, what do I do? What's going on here? How should I respond? And they responded, according to the law, what must be done, he asked. He asked them, he says, based upon the law of the Medes and the Persians, what should happen to her? She's not obeyed a command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Said she's willfully disobeyed the king. What does the law say should happen? Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and peoples in the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, so that they will despise her husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. You see, they've identified the problem. They said it's not just the fact she's disobeyed the king, but this is a wife disobeying her husband. And this word will get out across the entire kingdom. And women everywhere will understand that the queen has disobeyed her husband. And if she gets away with it, that's only going to encourage other women to disobey their husbands. And that's not something the king can afford to happen. So he said, for the queen's conduct will become known to all women, so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. Now, they kind of went overkill there, and they said, all the wives are going to start doing this. Not just a wife here and there. All the wives are going to start behaving the same way that Queen Vashti. In other words, if something doesn't happen, we're going to see a general revolt around the country as women refuse to obey or refuse to do what their husbands have instructed. So they had to come up with a rule. Had to come up with something. They said, there will be no end of the disrespect and discord. We got a problem. We got to do something. Therefore, because we got a problem, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. In other words, they said, you've got to get rid of her. She can no longer be queen. Write it in the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Even the king can't come back and revoke it. In the law that cannot be revoked, she is to be immediately. Now, interesting enough, it didn't say she should be killed. And she's not, we don't have any record that she is executed. But at least she can no longer be queen. At least she is no longer to be the king's wife. And we want it written down as a law so that everybody will understand this is what happens to one who does not, to a wife that does not obey her husband's instructions. And let the king give her royal position to someone who is better than she. Take the queenship away from her, give it to someone else. Better than she means we'll follow instructions. We'll do what they're told to do. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all the vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Isn't that interesting? That's the way to get respect, is to simply make an example. Because if everybody is afraid that this could happen to them, they're going to respect their husband. Interesting development. But that was what the advisors told the king to do. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom to pronounce, to each province in its own script, and to the people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be the ruler of his own household. Now, it wasn't just enough that he remove her. It wasn't just enough that he write a law that says she's never to come back in his presence. But he is going to send this edict out. In other words, you have all these different countries. They all have different languages. He is going to have an order written up in each of those different languages so everybody can read it, that every man is to be the ruler of his house, that no wife is to disobey her husband. That's the extent of his response to the queen's refusal to come in as he told her to. Now, go to chapter 2. Now, remember in the original there were no verse designations or chapter designations, but we're going to find now there is a period of time that passes between the last verse of chapter 1 and the first verse of chapter 2. Chapter 2 starts and says, later. I'm going to suggest to you that it was maybe as much as 4 years later. When the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Now, the reason I'm saying it's 4 years is we're told that the Queen Vashti refuses to come in at the order during the 3rd year of the King Xerxes' rule, and we find that Esther is going to be made queen in the 7th year of his rule, so that some 4 years is going to pass. Now, during that 4 years is when he's gone out to war, and he went out and fought the Greeks, and he lost. Now he's come back home, not quite as powerful as he had been before he went out, and he remembers he doesn't have a queen anymore. He remembers what she's done, and so this prompts him to begin to look to the future. When the king's anger had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed. Suggestion, maybe his countenance is such, he's wanting a queen. So his attendants say, we got a plan. Here's the plan. Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province in the realm, throughout the whole world, to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So here's what's going to happen. He issues this order, sends out commissioners, and they go throughout the whole empire. And they're looking for young females, young, attractive females. How old? 14, 15, 16. And they bring them back to Susa, the administrative capital, to be a part of the king's harem. Now, the king at that day and time kept a large number of young females in the palace and for his sexual purposes. Bring all these girls in and then give them beauty treatments, and then let him pick from one of those girls one to be the queen. Now, when you think about it, this is the ultimate of a cultural expression that would not be something that we would understand. The idea that a king could bring in all these young girls against their will. I mean, these girls were not being asked to come. They were being ordered to come. These young girls were being taken away from their parents, away from their homes, away from their culture, away from everything that was familiar and comfortable to them, and taken to the citadel to be put in a palace. Yes, they were going to live in royalty, live in splendor, but their purpose there was to be sexually abused by this old man. That's just something that we don't culturally appreciate, but this is what's happening. This is what's going on. And he says, bring them in, and then they would undergo these beauty treatments. And then the king would pick one of them to be his queen. That's the plan. The king liked the plan and agreed to it. Now we're looking in verse 5 of chapter 2. Now there was in citadel of Susa, this capital city, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. In 597, Nebuchadnezzar had come in and removed the king of Judah, Jehoiachin, and had taken him into captivity, and he brought several people with him. Now, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been brought in earlier. But he brought people with him. That Ezekiel was probably a part of that group. And one of the people he brought in was this Kish, and now this is one of his descendants, Mordecai, who is living, we're talking now, 100 years or so, living in exile in what had been the Babylonian Empire is now the Persian Empire, and he's living in Susa, the capital city. And he is a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither a father or a mother. So he has a cousin who is also in exile, living there in the citadel, in Susa, whose mom and dad had died, and he had taken her in and raised her. The girl was also known as Esther. Esther was her Persian name. Hadassah was her Jewish name. She was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. So here we have a very attractive, young, Jewish female living in the citadel. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. So they're bringing these young girls in from all over the world. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. Now, notice it said Esther was also taken. Again, remember, these girls aren't volunteering. This is not like, would you like the chance to become queen? Come, would you willfully and voluntarily? No, this is, they see a young lady, she's very pretty, maybe somebody the king would want in his harem. Immediately, they take her into custody, if you will, and transport her to the palace, and there is it placed under the custody or supervision of Haggai, who was the king's eunuch, and he was in charge of taking care of the harem, seeing that they are properly fed, properly clothed, and that they've received the beauty treatments, etc. The girl pleased him, talking about Haggai, and won his favor. She was pleasant. These girls could have been mad. They could have been bitter. They could have been angry. They could have been causing trouble. But it seems that Esther was pleasant. And as a result of her attitude and a result of her character, Haggai was disposed toward her. Maybe God had something to do with that. She won his favor. Immediately, he provided her beauty treatments and special foods. Again, this was given to her especially immediately because she had caught his attention and he wanted to help her out. He assigned her he assigned her 7 maids selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So now she is suddenly gone from unknown, unremarkable Jewish girl, orphan, living in Susa, to living in the king's palace with 7 maids and living in one of the finest rooms in the palace. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Okay? Nobody knew she was Jewish. Her being Jewish was not obvious from the outside. Her being Jewish was not obvious when they took her into custody. Her being Jewish was not obvious to those around her. Mordecai had told her, don't tell people you're Jewish. That'll only cause trouble for you. So she had obeyed his instruction and not told anybody. Every day he, Mordecai, walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So her cousin would come through the king's gate into the area of the courtyard outside where the harem lived, and would ask about Esther. Ask, maybe even sometimes even get to see her and talk to her, but ask about how she was doing, checking up on her. Every day he would do that. This was Mordecai's role as a protector, if you will, even though she was living in the harem. The idea that she is going to be given beauty treatments and preparing her for her introduction to the king. One commentator made a statement that I think helps us appreciate exactly what all that means. He said, Persia was one of many countries famous for its aromatic perfumes and ancient customs for the preparation of brides, including ritualistic baths, plucking of eyebrows, painting of the hands and feet with henna, facial makeup, and the application of beauty paste all over the body, meant to lighten the color of the skin and to remove spots and blemishes. So there was a whole ritual of beauty treatments that would be given to these young women in preparation for their introduction to the king. And now Haggai has rushed up and immediately given these beauty treatments to Esther, and she is there living in the harem, preparing to meet the king. There would be 6 months of oil treatments and 6 months of perfume treatments. Before the girl, let me read verse 12. Before the girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem into the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning she would return to another part of the harem to the care of Shahrazaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So here's the picture. All these girls are brought in. Each day, each night, a different girl would go into the king. He would sleep with her. The next day, when she left, she didn't go back to the harem where the young girls were waiting to go meet the king. She would go to another part of the palace where the concubines lived. The concubines were those women who had already had sexual relations with the king, and they may be called back. But they wouldn't be called back unless the king specifically called them by name. Now, think about the status of those ladies. They've been taken away from home, young teenagers. They've been brought in, and even though they've been treated royally, they know that they're there for one purpose, and that's for the sexual satisfaction of the king. And once they have gone over to the house of the concubines, they may never see the king again. But they're still going to be required to live there away from their family. In other words, they are doomed to a life of living there, not knowing if the king is going to call them back for another evening. They would have a very, very troublesome life in looking, thinking about their family and their home and all of that. That was the plan. That was the way this was working. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, came time for her to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. Now, because they're not coming back to the harem, they could take with them whatever they wanted. That was the rule. She only took what Haggai suggested, and we don't know what that was. And then she was sent to the king. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. In other words, the other ladies living in the harem, the eunuchs who were in charge of the harem, Haggai, who was the ruler, who was the chief of the eunuchs, they all were favorably disposed toward Esther because of her attitude and her character. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So 4 years have passed since Vashti's been dethroned, and now she has her one time to spend the night with the king. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. She is the one that he selects. Out of all these young ladies they brought in, she is the one that he selects to be his queen. She is the one that he selects to succeed Vashti as the queen. Again, this is a matter of a series of happenstances that suggest that God's in control. Now, this is difficult for us to understand, for us to really appreciate the idea that there is this abuse of these young girls, and that Esther is basically compliantly going along with something that seems so unacceptable to us. But that was that culture of that day. And she has now been made the queen. And this sets the stage for what happens now, and how this becomes an important feature of Jewish history in saving the people of Israel. As I said, from this series of lessons, we're going to see God is in control. Circumstances we don't understand and appreciate, God is in control. The second thing we're going to see through these series of incidents and what happens now with Esther as queen, God uses ordinary people to accomplish his will. She was nothing out of the ordinary as far as intelligence. Oh, she was cute. She was attractive. It said she was beautiful in form. But it wasn't like she had some extraordinary talent that would make her queen. God worked out all of these details for her to be queen. An ordinary person, unlikely person, a Jew in the Persian Empire, unlikely person. And the other thing we've learned from these lessons, God takes the most unusual of circumstances. Again, the worst of circumstances. I mean, for a young girl to be basically kidnapped for the purpose of sexual abuse and uses that kind of circumstance to accomplish his will to save the people of Israel. This is again a book in which where God may not be name by name, it's very clear God is in control. He's working in the shadows and he is in control. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the reminder. And as we look around the circumstances of our life and we see some very, very unpleasant circumstances, we have the assurance of knowing you're still in control. When it doesn't look like things are working out, we understand you work through circumstances and people in ways that we cannot imagine. We thank you and praise you for your sovereignty. We thank you and praise you for your love, and that you will work out our good and your will in our lives if we will but be obedient. And as we continue these series of lessons, and we are inspired by Esther's obedience, Father, we pray that you would work in us and enable us that we too might be the obedient servant that you called. For it's in the name of the one who called us, Jesus the Christ, we pray. Amen. Thank you.